Hello, YouTubers. This is AP World History Vocabulary. We are looking at the interwar period, post-World War I. So the next several videos, I'm going to outline kind of a lot of events that were going on worldwide from 1917 until World War II began in the 1930s, the early 1930s if you're in Asia, and the late 1930s if you're in Europe. So we're going to start with the United States and their role and to kind of highlight some key vocabulary words. So some of the key vocabulary words we're going to look at in this video are the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and then the New Deal, as well as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. So we'll start with the Roaring Twenties. So following World War I, the powers that won this war on the Allied side, the Entente powers, celebrated by signing the Treaty of Versailles, by forcing Germany to take much of the blame, by creating new nations and boundaries in Europe, and the United States, for the most part, accomplished creating a League of Nations and then went back to the United States and wanted to continue an isolationist policy where they would not get involved in future wars. And so during World War I, the United States had experienced kind of a massive economic boom by supplying a lot of their allies with foodstuffs, grain, weapons, and in the end of the war, military help, which brought an end to the war. So the United States gained a newfound respect, and without losing a huge amount of soldiers in this war, they were able to gain monetarily because of the amount that they had provided for this war. So they went back in the 1920s and had experienced, after having experienced this massive success, and life was good. Farmers were buying new equipment because their farms had expanded. Business was booming, and people started to become consumers, essentially buying all these new materials. And this is a time period called the Roaring Twenties. So the Roaring Twenties was a time of economic boom in the United States, also massive cultural output. Jazz was flourishing. New art and cityscapes were rising up, skyscrapers, technological improvements, and new consumer items, small appliances, and little cars, and things that were really exciting. Radios, everything was kind of exciting for the consumers, and people were buying stuff, and they were buying way too much. And this didn't last. This bubble burst pretty quickly as kind of the bills came in, and a lot of things happened all at once where the farms started to decline. The people started to lose faith in the stock market. They had overspent on credit. There was a number of factors, including drought in the Midwest, and all these kind of created the perfect storm, which led to the Great Depression. And so there was no one single factor that people could point to and say what caused the Great Depression, but the Great Depression nonetheless had a major impact on the United States and then again worldwide. Massive unemployment, defaulting on loans, banks failing, and people had a hard time making ends meet, especially farmers and the working class. So the Great Depression was something where people started to turn to their government and say, we need help here. This is something that the government needs to be able to step in and solve. And the early presidents in the 1920s, especially Herbert Hoover, weren't doing anything. They thought it would just pass on its own. And so the people quickly lost faith in government, and a lot of people started to say, you know, what's government actually worth if we can't rely on our government to help us? And so while other nations in the world were going through authoritarian leaders to get them out of the Great Depression, the United States relied on Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, became the longest serving president in the United States history. He served, well, he was elected to 4 terms. He served a little over 13 years. He died in his 4th term at the end of World War II. He led the United States out of the Great Depression and through the Second World War, and his career paralleled Adolf Hitler's. So he instituted what was called the New Deal, and this was heavy government involvement in the economy and heavy government involvement in recovery of the economy. And so this was focused on job creation and creating a welfare state to take care of the people who were unemployed and having a difficult time. So the New Deal was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's way of kind of getting the United States back on its feet. Now, some would argue that it was really World War II that got the United States back on their feet. But either way, FDR was in power for the New Deal throughout the Great Depression and then through World War II by the time the United States had kind of firmly gotten back on track. So he kept the United States out of war for as long as possible when World War II began, and it was really only the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor which brought the United States into war, and FDR declared war on Japan at that time and therefore brought the United States into war against Japan and Germany. So those are those 3 big words: the Roaring Twenties after World War I, the Great Depression during the 1930s, and then the New Deal politics in the late 1930s, and ending with the United States involvement in World War II. I'll be back to talk about some other some revolutions, and we'll do some comparative revolutions as well as some authoritarian responses to the Great Depression. Be awesome.